All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Four Horsemen of Real Estate podcast. I'm your host, Neil D'Souza, and we are going to be talking about the U.S. tariffs. And we're also going to get into what's the impact of us retaliating with tariffs. Here we go. So this is what's happening. The U.S. has said 25% across the board, we're going to charge on everything coming in from Canada. They've made some caveats, but that's what Donald Trump has thrown out. What's the impact of that, and which cities are facing the biggest issue is what we really need to talk about. We know that Southern Ontario, especially because of the automotive industry, is being hit in a very hard way. What's Ontario's response? One of the things is they're starting to take all American liquor off of the shelves. They're not even going to sell it here in Ontario. You can only buy Canadian. We've seen a huge push across the country where literally stickers are being put on Canadian products to say made in Canada. We are seeing cities like Calgary, Windsor, Kitchener-Waterloo, Brantford, Ontario, Guelph, Saginaw, Quebec. We're seeing all of these places getting hit because of what their production is, what they produce, and they send to the U.S. We've already begun to see job losses. Now, one of the places I haven't even talked about is the most exposed to the most amount of risk, the most amount of issue with all of this is St. John, New Brunswick. St. John has an oil refinery, and as a result, they produce oil and send it to the U.S. there. They refine it there, and their primary buyer is the U.S. They are extremely exposed. In fact, according to one index that rates exposure, they're saying that they are at 131% risk of a significant exposure to the tariffs. Okay, let's get an idea here of why are we seeing these job losses, these layoffs already happening, and why do we expect there to be more layoffs, more job losses? So right now, a company that has had a steel company that they know this 25% tariff is going to affect their bottom line, they're not going to see the effects today. They won't see the effects for maybe 30 days because the sales will not be coming in. In the U.S., they're not going to be buying as much steel as they've been buying from us. As a result, the steel company knows this, and they are laying off people right now. They're not waiting to find out in a month from now, hey, we didn't make as much money, now we need to lay all these people off. They have begun doing the layoffs right now. We're seeing this in a whole number of different sectors, including transportation, including production. This is already starting to happen where there's either hiring freezes or actual layoffs taking place. And what kind of numbers are we getting into if this happens and if this is if this continues for too long? So now that we know that the Trump tariffs have been put in place, we know what the impact, and we can forecast the impact of those tariffs. Now, what happens in the event of us retaliating? Because, of course, we've heard the government talking about retaliatory tariffs. And what will be the impact of Canada retaliating back against the U.S.? All right, let me just read something from an article here that breaks this down. From Brookings, they talk about the impact of tariffs on jobs and wages. The tariffs will take a toll on employment in all three countries, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. The U.S. employment will decline approximately 0.11% from the 25% tariffs on imports and rise to 0.25% losses of jobs with retaliation. Now, based on 2024 job data, this is equivalent to over 177,000 job losses from the 25% tariffs, rising to over 400,000 job losses in the event that Canada and Mexico retaliate. Now let me continue to read here. Job losses in Canada and Mexico would be around 1.3% and 2.3% respectively. And based on 2024 job numbers, this would amount to 278,000 Canadian jobs and 1.4 million Mexican jobs. In the event of retaliation, meaning we retaliate back with tariffs of our own against the U.S., job losses would increase to almost 2.5% and 3.6% of total employment in Canada and Mexico, equivalent to over 510,000 Canadian jobs and 2.2 million Mexican jobs. So the interesting question is, why would we retaliate in the first place? Or maybe more importantly, what happens when we double the number of job losses that come out as a result of us retaliating against the U.S.? What happens to mortgage payments that people can't make because they no longer have a job or they've been laid off? What happens to people's car payments? What happens to, we've got a crisis of food insecurity going on in the country right now. What happens when this many people no longer have food or money to be able to afford food, clothing, shelter? This is what we're really looking at in terms of dealing with these tariffs. All right, guys, this has been another episode of the Four Horsemen Real Estate Podcast. Who knows how many jobs we're going to lose? I really didn't want to do an episode where we were this cranky and this upset and maybe more fear-mongering. But if you keep your head about you, there's a lot of opportunity on the other side, and make sure you're moving yourself forward in these uncertain times. I'm your host, Neil D'Souza, and we'll see you again next week.
When the ones around trust in their word, they walk the talk in the world of investment, they make their mark.